This is the Cliff Yates Show. Personal growth, motivation, inspiration, and philosophies for a great life.
Hey everybody, Cliff Yates. Welcome to the podcast, and I'm glad you're checking in. Just maybe the information today might prolong or save your life. Now that would be great. Maybe it won't be needed, but you never know. The title of this episode is How Not to Die. And there's actually a book called How Not to Die, and I'm going to talk about that today. But rule number one is don't die. If you want to be a great success, if you want to have a long, wonderful life, rule number one, don't die. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. I was reminded recently about some things that happened in my life back in 2015. My dad had a heart attack. And the number one killer of both men and women in the United States of America is heart disease. It was the number one killer back in 2015, and today, 2023, it's the number one killer of men and women, heart disease. And as I'm going to tell you, it's one of the few diseases that can not only be stopped and prevented, it can be reversed without surgery, without medication. And doctors in the medical profession don't want to tell you that because they're in the business of prescribing medicines and doing procedures. Prescriptions and procedures. That's the business they're in, and that's how they sustain themselves. They're really not going to want to promote, most doctors, not all, but most doctors and surgeons are not going to want to promote that a healthy diet, a drastic change in diet, can not only prevent heart disease, it can reverse it. They're not going to want to prescribe themselves out of business. My dad had a heart attack 2015, and just before he had his heart attack, a friend came to me and said, "Hey, have you checked out this series on Netflix yet? It's called Forks Over Knives. And it's still on Netflix. Please go watch this series." And it's about two surgeons who, without knowing each other at the time, they were both doing studies on heart disease. And they both were coming up with the same conclusions without knowing it. And so I was watching this series and I was just amazed at what I was finding out about what I was eating, about heart disease, and how you could change your diet, your lifestyle, and you could prevent and or reverse heart disease. And so right after watching this series, I started changing my diet immediately. My friend gave me the recommendation of watching this because I drank a lot of milk. When I was growing up and I wanted to gain weight, I drank gallon after gallon of whole milk to put weight on myself. And so I continued later in life to drink a lot of milk. But I was drinking non-fat milk, thinking, this is healthy. All the fat's out of the milk, and I got used to the taste of it, and I loved it. And so I'm thinking, I'm okay, not realizing that there is so much casein in non-fat milk, which causes heart disease, that I really was not on such a great diet. And so I'm watching this series, learning about heart disease, and now I'm traveling back to Rochester, New York, where my dad is in the ICU, and I'm seeing him intubated. I'm seeing everybody else who's in the ICU, and I'm seeing the tubes coming out of everybody. And if you take that scene in, and since heart disease is the number one killer of men and women, I'm sure that most everybody, if they haven't already, has been touched by someone having a heart attack or having heart disease or some kind of artery clogging medical condition. And so it's touched you in some way. But if you're in that position where you're in the ICU and you have a friend or a loved one or yourself intubated or if you're in the ICU, you're in serious trouble. And you got tubes coming out of you. I'm taking this all in. I'm taking in the visuals, the smells. I'm so motivated not to ever get there that I'm willing to do anything. I'm willing to make drastic changes in my lifestyle and in my diet. Now, we're from a small town in upstate New York, so my mom Dad, myself, we grew up in this small town, village of Caledonia, New York, a village of about 4,000 people. And so now we're at the Rochester, New York, the city of Rochester's ICU unit, which is about 25 miles from our little village where I grew up. But we're in there 2 weeks. And my dad's in there from his little village. And while we're there, 2 other people come into that ICU. And the other 2 people also needed stents put in to open up arteries to get the blood flowing to the heart and to the brain to stay alive. Now, stents are something that is amazing. Doctors put them in right and left. They love to do it. And it is a miracle procedure for opening up arteries. Now, we just don't want to get to the point where we need stents, because once a stent is put in, because I've learned until a stent is put in, that artery and the body can pretty much heal itself. It can unclog itself by a drastic change in diet and or exercise. In those combinations, the arteries can open up on themselves. Now, once a stent is put in, it damages the artery to the extent that it can never reverse that damage, although it's a life-saving procedure. So I'm not poo-pooing stents altogether. I'm just saying we never want to get to the spot where we don't want to rely on, well, if my arteries get clogged, they can always put stents in, so I'll just live, who cares what I do? I'll deal with the consequences because of medical technology. No, we don't want to get to that point where we need stents and or a pacemaker or any kind of heart procedure to save our lives or to live longer. Now, shortly after I had watched now what I did was, because I was so inspired and or motivated and or scared seeing my dad in the ICU after the heart attack, and they had to use the paddles on him and revive him, bring him back to life after CPR broke 3 of his ribs. And but believe me, he was thankful they did it because he was happy to be alive. But after watching the show Forks Over Knives, and the title in itself tells you you'd rather cure your heart disease by eating than procedures and pills. So forks over knives. Let's eat ourselves back to our heart health instead of relying on pills and procedures, which is what the medical industry would like to prescribe to us just because that's their training and that's their job to do, understandably. So shortly after that, my mom, she recommended a book to me that she had read, and it was called How Not to Die by Dr. Greger. And I thought, listen, I have really plenty of information. Now I don't need another book on this. I mean, I really didn't like the title to begin with, How Not to Die. I was trying not to focus on death. I was focusing on living. But I got this book, and I was amazed by this book. This doctor who, he's still active today, especially on YouTube. He has a channel called nutritionfacts.org. Dr. Greger, nutritionfacts.org, and he uses the Freedom of Information Act to discover studies that are not funded by the dairy and meat industry, but are valid studies that show us how not to die and keep us heart healthy. His book, this is the preface from his book, How Not to Die. I recommend you get this book. It all started with my grandmother. I was only a kid when the doctor sent her home in a wheelchair to die. Diagnosed with end-stage heart disease, she had already had so many bypass operations that the surgeons essentially ran out of plumbing. The scarring from each open heart surgery had made the next one more difficult, until they finally ran out of options. Confined to a wheelchair with crushing chest pain, her doctors told her there was nothing else they could do. Her life was over at age 65. They basically sent her home with a death sentence. Told her to get her things in order basically to prepare to die, age 65. Too many heart procedures, too much scar tissues on her heart. There's nothing more they could do. This is Dr. Greger. I'll continue. I think what sparks many kids to want to become doctors when they grow up is watching a beloved relative become ill or even die. But for me, it was watching my grandmother get better. Soon after she was discharged from the hospital to spend her last days at home, a segment aired on 60 Minutes about Nathan Pritikin, an early lifestyle medicine pioneer who had been gaining a reputation for reversing terminal heart disease. He had just opened a new center in California, and my grandmother, in desperation, somehow made the cross-country trek to become one of its first patients. I remember when I first went to California to join the LA Sheriff's Department that I stayed with my aunt and uncle in Santa Monica, and there was a Pritikin Medical Center in Santa Monica, and I used to drive by it on Pacific Coast Highway. But I believe the one Dr. Greger's grandmother went to was in Santa Barbara. But I'll continue from the book, How Not to Die. Somehow she made the cross-country trek to become one of its first patients. This was a live-in program where everyone was placed on a plant-based diet and then started on a graded exercise regimen. They wheeled my grandmother in, and she walked out. They wheeled her in, and a few weeks later, she walked out after being given this death sentence that she was to go home and die. I'll never forget that. She was even featured in Pritikin's biography, Pritikin. There's a book called Pritikin, The Man Who Healed America's Heart. My grandma was described as one of the death's door people. And this is from the book. Francis Greger from North Miami, Florida, arrived in Santa Barbara at one of Pritikin's early sessions in a wheelchair. Mrs. Greger had heart disease, angina, and claudication. Her condition was so bad she could no longer walk without great pain in her chest and legs. Within 3 weeks, though she was not only out of her wheelchair, but she was walking 10 miles a day. 10 miles a day? No, listen, I need to up my game. I have been walking on the beach. My wife walks. When she walks 6 miles. I just walked today 2 miles, and I thought I was doing good. This lady, 65, and she's in a wheelchair when she goes in. She comes out, she's walking 10 miles a day. When I was a kid, I'm continuing from the book, How Not to Die, Dr. Greger. When I was a kid, that was all that mattered. I got to play with Grandma again. But over the years, I grew to understand the significance of what had happened. At that time, the medical profession didn't even think it was possible to reverse heart disease. Drugs were given to try to slow the progression, and surgery was performed to circumvent clogged arteries to try to relieve symptoms. But the disease was expected to get worse and worse until you died. Now, however, we know that as soon as we stop eating an artery-clogging diet, our bodies can start healing themselves, in many cases opening up arteries without drugs or surgery. Now, this is amazing. My grandma was given her medical death sentence at age 65. Grandma Greger, 65, go home to die. Thanks to a healthy diet and lifestyle, she was able to enjoy another 31 years on this earth with her 6 grandchildren. 65, come on, comes out walking 10 miles a day, lives another 31 years, 96 years old. Just think of everything she would have missed, dying at 65, 66, maybe 67. She lived to 96 to enjoy all her 6 grandchildren. The woman who was once told she only had weeks to live didn't die until she was 96 years old. Her near miraculous recovery not only inspired one of those grandkids to pursue a career in medicine, but granted her enough healthy years to see him graduate from medical school. So Dr. Gregor's grandma, from her story, inspired him to become a surgeon. And she not only didn't die when they said she was going to die, she lived long enough to see him graduate from medical school. Now, this is amazing. And so I'm hoping this is inspiring people, because in our standard American diet, SAD they call it, right? Standard American diet. I mean, we just have to reverse what we have in our mind is a healthy diet. And now, once I was inspired by all this, I'll admit I got a little radical. I got a little radical in my diet. I went totally vegan. I had no meat. I stopped all milk, and I went to almond milk, because my theory was, I'm just going to try this for 2 months. That's all. 2 months, I'm going to try this. Very strict, because I had just had a blood test. And so I wanted to be very strict. And then I was going to go back in for another blood test. Let's see exactly what happens here. And I'm going to tell you what happens after 3 months. 3 months of I was strict vegan diet. So my cholesterol went from 250 after 3 months and went down to 170. 250 to 170. And my triglycerides went from 190 to 75. Now, triglycerides are basically like fat in the bloodstream. Too many triglycerides is like having little razor blades in your arteries. And so, from 190 to 70, total cholesterol, 250 to 170, 3 months. So I knew those results were important, life-saving, and life-prolonging, so I was hooked. Now, even Dr. Gregor will tell you, even though the premier diet for this would be strict vegan diet, it's not good for your own mental and emotional and really your ability to do it, to have an all-or-nothing program. So now I specifically, through blood test, if you go vegan, then you're going to need a B complex supplement. You're going to need a vitamin D, and I believe it was you're going to need some supplements with a vegan diet. And I needed it for I needed supplements for my omega-3s were low. So I made a decision when we moved here to Florida, since my doctor says your omega-3s are really low. And I don't recommend fish oil pills, because you don't know, capsules, because you don't know where that fish oil came from. There's no regulations on fish oil. So he says fish is the best source of omega-3s. Salmon, number one. So I went from vegan to plant-based, which is better. I'm telling you, this is the thing you want to do. If you're having pizza 7 days a week, don't go to 0. So you go from 7 days a week, 3 days a week. Instead of having pizza 7 days a week, you go to 3 days a week. Now that leap from 7 to 3 is not that big. You can do that. You can do the 7 to 3. And believe me, once you get to 3, going to once is not that hard. And just cutting down from 7 to 3, the long-term effects on your heart, on your health, will be really substantial. It's unbelievable. Then you can go a step further and you can take the meat off your pizza. Don't have pepperoni. There was a fantastic study. This was so interesting that it's in the movie Forks Over Knives. It was so interesting. Now, this is data that is a fact. These are facts they discovered in studying heart disease. It was in World War II. They have graphic data from World War II that shows that the ravages of heart disease in Norway were totally halted. Totally halted. In World War II, 1939 to 1945, the Germans came into their occupied countries that they occupied, and they took away all of the dairy cows, the beef cattle, all the pigs, all pork, chickens, and they took them for themselves, for the Germans and their soldiers. And so they have graphic data that shows Norway, they shows their heart disease rates prior to World War II. World War II comes along, the Germans take all their beef and dairy cattle and their pigs away, and they have the data on their heart disease just plummets. Their heart disease goes to near zero, because after the Germans took all their beef cattle and dairy farms, the native populations had to survive on whole grains, legumes, vegetables, and fruit. And the results were almost immediately in the drop of heart disease. It was just crazy. And the data they used didn't stop there. They continued, and they studied the data after World War II was over, when the dairy cows and the beef cattle and the pigs were returned to the countries like Norway. Then heart disease ratcheted right back up to where they were pre-World War II. The data is there. The link between beef, meat, and dairy causing heart disease, it's all there. And it's there for us to take that and to change our lifestyle. And I hope you do. And I hope maybe, just maybe, you'll make some changes that may save your life or at least prolong it for many years to come. And you're going to live a long, fulfilling life. Now, full disclosure, I went totally, I was so inspired and motivated and or scared from my dad being in the ICU and seeing forks over knives. I was motivated I went strictly vegan for 3 months. 3 months, I went strict because I wanted to see, because I had just had a blood test, and I wanted to see if I went strictly vegan, what the results of that next blood test would be. And so I had a blood test. I went strictly vegan for 3 months, and then I had another blood test done. And my total cholesterol went from 250 to 170. 250 to 170. My triglycerides, which is basically fat in the bloodstream, triglycerides in your bloodstream is like little razor blades cutting your arteries. That went from 180 down to 70. Triglycerides, fat in the blood, 180 down to 70. I'll tell you, I was inspired. But like Dr. Greger said, it shouldn't be an all or nothing. So I went on, I continued that for about a year. But the problem with all or nothing is if you have it in your mind, I can never have that again, it's going to be hard to maintain. It will not be sustainable. Although that would probably be the ideal diet would be a total vegan. But if you go vegan, then you need supplements. You need B complex, you need a vitamin D, and you need omega-3s. My omega-3s were low, which is one of the reasons why I went from a strict vegan to a plant-based diet, because my doctor said when I moved here to Florida, he goes, well, your omega-3s are low. Everything is great, but your omega-3s are low. And he didn't suggest fish oil pills because they're not regulated. So you really don't know the quality of the fish oil that you're getting. So he recommended more fish. And specifically, he said salmon was the best for omega-3s. So I've changed my diet now where I call it plant-based. So I'm not all or nothing. After church every Sunday, every once in a while, I have empanadas with beef and or chicken. And I'll have a Cuban sandwich with pork in it. But I'm predominantly plant-based for all the reasons that I've just told you in this podcast. And it served me well. And I feel great. And I hope that, and I'll relay another story that kind of inspired me to put this podcast out, because it's been a few years since I was on this journey, but just recently, a couple weeks ago, a friend of mine, we're playing tennis. We're playing a doubles match. He went for a shot, and all of a sudden he dropped to the court on his back, and we ran to him, and it looked like he was having a seizure. He was still breathing. He was gurgling, having trouble. Eyes rolled back in his head. And then he stopped breathing, and his heart stopped. And I didn't know that the person I was playing with was a retired physician. He was a retired doctor. He immediately started CPR, and he had to do CPR for a few minutes. I would say probably 12 minutes or more. But at the facility, Kiwi Tennis Club, we have at the facility 2 AED units, defibrillators, and another retired doctor brought the defibrillator over, and he used it on my buddy, and it started his heart up again. His heart was completely stopped. CPR, 12 to 15 minutes. They put him on the AED defibrillator, which is a great unit. We should all have them. Tells you exactly what to do. Because it took a few minutes. The police were there right away, but it took a few minutes for the fire and the ambulance to get there. I want to say probably 20 minutes. And 3 days later, pacemaker, 2 stents, and he's doing great. He's doing fantastic. He sounds strong, healthy, and CPR and the defibrillator saved his life. And now he's in pretty good shape because he plays tennis 3-4 days a week. And he was released from the hospital after 3 days. 3 days. And one of the few times they say that anybody is ever released from the ICU, usually they go to a regular hospital room and they get physical therapy, and then they're released from there. He was released from the ICU because he was in good shape, other than his heart attack, and he's doing really well. So, and thank the Lord for that. I thank the Lord because I did pray that day pretty vehemently for my friend to be brought back to life, and he was. So that reminded me of all that I had learned in prevention and reversal of heart disease and how we need to be on it. So listen, I hope today maybe inspires you to make a change that might save or prolong your life. And if it does, let me know. If you think somebody needs to hear this or see this, share it with them. If you're listening on a podcast platform, please subscribe to the channel. And if you're watching and or listening on YouTube, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and hit that little bell next to the subscribe button, because then you'll be notified of the next video when it comes out. I'm so happy you checked in today. And you know what? I hope this saves somebody's life. I know it probably saved mine. All right, I'm Cliff Yates.